My entire career, doing this work for, more than 2 decades now, I've never compared and I've never brought up the Nazis.
Mm.
Now it's appropriate. And there were Germans who stood up to the Nazis and paid heavily. There were groups within German society, doctors, communists, others, who stood up and were sent to concentration camps and were executed. There were white South Africans, many of them, were Jewish, Joe Slovo and Ruth First and others, who were aiding Nelson Mandela in the military operations of the ANC. White people who stood up and paid heavily. Many were killed, bombed, exiled. Where's the Israeli opposition to Zionism? Where are the thousands, the hundreds, anything? If 100,000 Israelis went to the streets right now and demanded an end to the slaughter in Gaza, nobody would get killed. Maybe a few people will be arrested, but it's not going to be, nobody's going to get shot. It's not going to be like that. It's not like what the Nazis did to the dissenters. It's not like what the South African apartheid regime did to dissenters. And where are they? So where is this liberal society? Where are these people? They're very comfortable being where they are, but they always fall. And they like being called peace, like a peace movement or liberal Zionists. But when push comes to shove, they always line up and they toe the line with Zionism and they toe the line with a genocidal apartheid state.
So then that makes me wonder your personal evolution, because you come from this society. Your family was deeply involved in the founding of it, as you've written about. Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. Israel's genocide in Gaza has shocked much of the world, especially when combined with the fascist rhetoric of its leaders. We saw Israel's defense minister openly classify Palestinians in Gaza as human animals when calling for starving them all. We recently watched as Israel's media personalities openly endorsed gang rape as a weapon against Palestinians, none of whom, they say, are innocent, not even the children. We saw the Israeli rapists given airtime to defend their actions, as Western media covered it all up through omission. And we watched Israel's citizens protest against punishing the rapists, as videos show parents in Gaza collecting bags of the unidentified remains of their children again and again and again after Israeli airstrikes. We see Israel's soldiers celebrating their destructive capacity in deranged TikTok videos. This behavior doesn't represent a marginal view. Poll after poll shows Israeli society is largely in agreement with the genocide in Gaza. Many are left wondering how a society can become this hateful. Was it always this way since Israel's founding and the mask has just slipped? Or did Israel descend into fascism more recently? Is there any Israeli left pushing back against it? Are they any different than the right in their views of Palestinians? Joining me to explain is author, activist, and founder and head of the newly established Palestine House of Freedom in Washington, D.C., Miko Peled. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The full interview is available to Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/Breakthrough News. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Miko Peled, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. Good to be with you, Rania.
It's really great to have you on. We've had you on the Breakthrough live stream Freedom Side before, but I think this is our debut episode on Dispatches. So it's taken far too long to get you on. So I'm glad to have you here, and there's so much to talk about. You are full of a lot of insight and information about the horrors that we're watching unfold that are being carried out by the country of Israel. And I think a good place to start is where a lot of people's attention has turned in the last couple of weeks, and that is the reports coming out about the fact that Israel has been using rape as a weapon in these prisons that they've created since October 7th, with, including, one gang rape that was carried out against a Palestinian prisoner, was on film because it was on CCTV, was leaked, I think it was last week. And then we saw some crazy reactions from Israeli media, where you had Israeli media personalities going on TV and basically justifying this as a proper punishment for Palestinians. I know Israeli Channel 12, I know is like considered a pretty right-wing channel, but it's quite popular. You can give me more information about that. But they had done some poll about whether it's okay to rape people or not. And like more people than not said it was okay to rape people. And I think a lot of those who've been watching this genocide in Gaza unfold are a bit taken aback by the behavior we're witnessing on display coming from Israeli institutions, Israeli media, Israeli government officials. So let's start with the rape issue. I'm just curious, what has your reaction been to seeing the attitude on display in Israel about using rape as a weapon? And how were you surprised by this?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the show again, and it's good to see you and be with you. Surprise, it's one of those things where it's a combination of shock, but really no surprise. We have an almost 8-decade history of one of the most brutal genocide campaigns, known to man. And it's been very consistent. There have been issues, there have been stories of sexual abuse and sexual using the sex and sexual abuse as a weapon against Palestinians going back to 1948. I mean, there's nothing new about the news. It just seems to be a little more intense now. And Israeli society has become a little less polite in the way it talks about these things. So in the past, they would pretend to be in shock. They would pretend that these were terrible things, but they let them happen anyway, and nobody was ever punished. But now it's full display of, why not, and again, I've been hearing these stories because I have so many Palestinian friends who were former prisoners, and the stories of sexual abuse are not new. This, again, happens to be a very intense case, and now the number of prisoners is so much higher than it ever was before. And the brutality against Palestinians has certainly reached a new level, a new peak. And so, again, like I said, it's on one side. On one hand, it's absolutely shocking and horrifying. On the other hand, I don't see why anybody should be taken aback or why anybody should be surprised. It's a little bit like expecting a ceasefire agreement. It's like you're expecting a ceasefire agreement from a genocidal maniac state that's been engaged in this for 8 decades. Why? What is the context that you would expect this to happen? What kind of world are people living in that this would shock them, the torture would shock them, and that they would expect them to agree to a ceasefire? And besides, ceasefire in the face of genocide, I don't get it. So yeah, that's what it is. I mean, it's horrifying, and I've had many friends who were arrested around October 7th and then released gradually. The last one being Bassem Tamimi, and there are stories, rampant stories, going on about all kinds of horrific sexual abuse. Issa Amro was arrested around October 8th or so. He came out. He was unable really to function for quite some time. And then he told his story as well, about the sexual abuse. It's absolutely horrifying, but I don't think it's new. I don't think it's a reason to be surprised. It's if anything else, it should be a reason to fortify the efforts to bring down the regime and end the apartheid and end the genocide.
I mean, I guess also you have more institutions coming out and essentially confirming what Palestinians are saying has been happening. You have this report from B'Tselem coming out and saying this Israeli human rights organization. You had a group of UN experts write a report in recent weeks laying out what Palestinians have been enduring in this network of torture facilities that Israel's created post October 7th. And that includes sexual abuse and gang rape, and on top of that, electrocution to the genitals, like hanging people from ceilings, stripping them down and making them stay naked, tying them to their beds. I mean, just like really atrocious dungeon-like stuff. But I think it's also important to recognize when you talk about the fact that this stuff has been happening, it's just maybe more intense now. And then you made another point about the fact that the Israeli officials are that they don't really hide it. And I think that that's an interesting point to touch on, because when I asked you to come on, I said to you, Miko, come on so you can explain Israel's descent into fascism. And you said to me, what do you mean descent into fascism? It's always been fascist. So I want you to elaborate on that. When you say Israel's always been fascist, what do you mean?
Well, again, I don't know if fascist is the term, but it's just definitely been an apartheid state from the very beginning, which is worse, I don't know, but it's definitely been a racist, genocidal apartheid regime from the very, very beginning. And I think people like to hold on to this very misguided notion that there used to be a good Israel, that back in the day things were better, that before 1967, before the occupation began, things were better. I mean, I remember in the 70s, people like Joan Baez and that caliber of people who are identified with human rights, with peace activism, would visit and perform there, not thinking about it, not giving it a second thought. Today, of course, they wouldn't dream of going there. And a lot of people still want to hang on to this idea that actually, at its core, Israeli society is good. Israelis are good. I think to a large degree because Americans think that since they look like us, then maybe they have the same values. Although again, I'm not sure what that means in the American context either. But it's a complete sham. It's not true. I mean, the generation that allowed what happened throughout 1947, 1948, the massacres, the horrifically, sadistic campaign of ethnic cleansing. And mind you, this was 3 years after the end of the Holocaust, 3 years after the end of the genocide of the Jews in Europe, and the creation of laws against genocide and crimes against humanity. Just several years after these laws were codified, they allowed this to happen in Palestine. They allowed people to go into the Zionists to go into Palestine and commit these horrific crimes, and it hasn't stopped since. And all these leaders, I was talking to actually some Palestinians, and they like to talk about Rabin and the good old days of Rabin, and how he was a man of peace. I said, what are you talking about? He was a brutal war criminal. He wanted nothing to do with the Palestinians, certainly not peace. And this whole Oslo sham facade was only to bring us to where we are today. There was no attempt at peace. So people like to hold on, and even many Palestinians, I think, like to hold on to this idea that there is a good in Israelis. There is somebody there but there isn't. It's been a racist, genocidal state. It's been a racist, genocidal society from the very beginning. If we want to end the genocide, if you want to give some semblance of a normal life to Palestinians, we have to end the genocide by ending the apartheid state.
Yeah, I mean, it is really incredible because I think that what's happening today, and I want to hear your thoughts on this, is, there's different kinds of people that are in charge of Israel now, people who really don't care about sort of protecting that idea of Israel as being some sort of like beacon. Because, the Israelis for a long time used to kind of speak out of two sides of their mouth, right? Like there's the side for domestic consumption, which is much more honest about what's happening and what Israel wants. And then there's the side that speaks to the international community. And the side that used to speak to the international community was much better at, wrapping its ethnic cleansing, apartheid, its territorial expansionist ambitions in the rhetoric of liberalism. Whereas the Israelis who are in charge today don't really seem to care about doing that so much, which is how you have someone like, I guess, Netanyahu saying the kinds of things that he says, or even, crazier people like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich. So I want to talk about those people because I think that that's perhaps what's changed in Israel is the kinds of people who are in charge, the things they say. They have a very theocratic nature to them that perhaps past leaders of Israel didn't. And maybe a good place to start is can you explain to our audience who Meir Kahane is? Because his ideas seem to be quite represented in the current Israeli leadership. So who's Meir Kahane and why does he still matter today despite the fact that he's dead?
Well, I think Meir Kahane is a small fry compared to what we're seeing today. I think in a way, Meir Kahane was, he represented this more, a much more honest expression of Zionism. He said, look, it's either us or them. I want it to be us, so we got to get rid of them and stop all this nonsense, stop all this pretense about peace, stop all this pretense about human rights. We got to get rid of them. We got to get rid of them now. If they won't go willingly, we're going to have to kill them. And that was basically, and he was considered like, right-wing extremist. He was actually elected to the House of Representatives, to the Knesset once, and members of Knesset, even the right-wing Likud people wouldn't sit next to him, wouldn't be seen next to him. But when we look at his disciples, who are, like you said, Ben Gvir and Smotrich and those people, who are his disciples and admired him and admired his ideology, I compare them to the generation of my father, who were young officers and went through Palestine and ravaged it and destroyed it and committed the ethnic cleansing of 1947, 1948. The only difference is geographically that these people are focused on the West Bank mostly, while the older generation focused on other parts of the country. Although they wanted the West Bank too, they were very disappointed when in 1949 Israel did not include the borders of the country did not include the West Bank. And they were not religiously motivated. They were Zionist zealots, where these guys are Zionists and religious. So they wear the yarmulke and they have a connection to God, where these were secular, kind of believed themselves to be socialists. The difference, I think, are cosmetic. The cruelty, the brutality, the desire, more than the desire, the actual planning and execution of the genocide, of the ethnic cleansing, is really no different. And then that generation of my father, which included people like Yitzhak Rabin, who later on, became generals, and then they became prime ministers, and on, people looked at them as though they were some kind of, peace-loving people, good people. And that's, like you said, it's because they had this pretense. They were very good at this pretense. They're also, they knew how to, and they cared about the appearance. These people don't care about the appearance. Like Meir Kahane didn't care about the appearance. He said, look, we're Zionists. We're here to take our country back. We don't care about these Arabs anyway. Kick them out, send them to another Arab country. This whole idea that there are 22 other Arab countries, why do they need our country? All that kind of rhetoric came from there. But I really think that it's the hypocrisy of the early Zionists who don't like to be associated with the West Bank settlers. They don't like to. So settlers is a term that's reserved only for Israelis who are in the West Bank. Well, what about people who live in Tel Aviv or Haifa or anywhere else? How are they less settlers than those? How are they less cruel than those? How are they less criminal than those? And really the reality is that the settlers of the West Bank are just a mirror image of the rest of Israeli society. The Israeli society doesn't like to look at that. They don't like to admit that. And, you're talking about, the language and what's used for domestic consumption and what's used outwardly. Israelis, get really angry when you say settler colonialism, or you say colonialism, or you say settlers. But in Hebrew, those words are everywhere. Every town has a settler street and a colonizer's hill and a colonizer's avenue and a colonizer's plaza. Every street and every corner has a settler and colonial, and it's admired. The colonizers, the early settlers, the early colonizers, but don't say it in English. I remember I was meeting a Palestinian friend who lives in 1948, and we're meeting near Jaffa, and he said, "Well, let's meet at what's it called? I think the translation is something like the colonizers' parking lot near Colonizer Street." And he said it in Hebrew, and I said, what did you just say? It suddenly dawned on me just how common it is to use these words in Hebrew. There's a street there that's the colonizers, conquerors, whatever it is, occupiers. Wow. I said, this is incredible. And in Hebrew, it's everywhere, and nobody thinks twice to say it. But don't say occupiers or colonizers or settlers in English. So there is that, this hypocrisy, which I suppose is natural and makes perfect sense. And they're very, very good at it. But again, I'll go back to the very beginning. I don't believe that there is a dissent to this. I think it was like that from the very beginning. But I think maybe because of the way they looked or the way they spoke, people like to forgive that early generation and focus on the ones that are there today.
Yeah, I think there's also the fact that it's harder to hide. I mean, you have this guy, I can't remember what his first name was, but his last name is Schlesinger. He's a journalist for Israel Hayom, and he went on Channel 12. I can add the clip in. We don't need to listen to it now. We probably saw it making the rounds on the internet, but he went on and said, basically he defended the use of rape, and said that this is a punishment that's deserved and they should be doing it and more of it or something insane. It was something insane like that.
אמרתי לחבריי שבגדול זה מעניין את העכוז, לא מה עושים לבחורצ'יק הזה.
מה? זה מה שבאמת מעניין אותך?
חד משמעית. אני אתן לי להשלים, אני אסביר.
חיילים שמבצעים עבירה, חשודים בעבירה של אינוס, בעצור כפות. זה לא מעניין אותך?
יפה.
לא מעניין אותך תואר המידות של החיילים שלנו? אגב, אלה לא חיילים, אם הם עשו הם לא חיילים, הם עבריינים.
בגדול, עוד פעם, זה מעניין לי את העכוז מה עשו לאיש חמאס הזה. אני כל הזמן זוכר, קודם כל, הדבר היחיד שמבחינתי הוא בעיה פה, זה שזו לא איזושהי מדיניות מוסדרת של המדינה להתעלל בצירים. כי בגדול, זה גם, קודם כל מגיע להם, וזה אחלה נקמה שאנחנו צריכים לתת להם. ודבר שני, אולי זה גם ישמש אותנו קצת יותר כהרתעה. זאת אומרת, ברגע שהצד השני, שצריך לזכור, ג'וש.
And then he went on to apologize, expressing his profound regret at his advocacy of raping Palestinian prisoners as standard state policy. He regretted saying it because it was translated into English, and he said that was absolutely not my intention. So I think that there's also something happening where everything's online today, right? Like it's like Yoav Gallant can go and call Palestinians human animals in Hebrew and make this disgusting speech in the beginning back in October saying, let's starve them all, let's cut off the electricity, cut off the water. Immediately it gets translated into English, and now you have that as evidence for genocidal intent. That wasn't necessarily the case, 40 years ago. When, you've got Middle East Eye waiting to capture everything that happens in Hebrew media. So I think it's come as a bit of a shock for a lot of people to kind of get an inside look about of the conversation happening inside Israel amongst Israelis. But I think also the religious nature of it's interesting too, because that, I guess, is the sort of internal contradiction in Israel now, is you have people like Ehud Olmert, I think recently wrote some article talking about how he's scared of people like Ben Gvir. And just for those, if anybody doesn't know, Ben Gvir is the national security minister of Israel, I believe.
If they don't know who he is, they're better off.
Yeah. He's extremely far right religious zealot. He qualifies as a fascist, I think. Just openly wants to send all the Arabs, either kill them or send all the Palestinians in the West Bank to Jordan, send all the ones in Gaza to Egypt, or kill them. And then you've got Bezalel Smotrich, who's the finance minister, who is of this kind of same ideology, this religious, hardcore Zionist that wants to do the same things I just mentioned, and was recently made a bit famous in the last couple of weeks, once again, this time for complaining that the world won't let Israel starve Gaza, and that's not fair. Even though the world absolutely is letting Israel starve Gaza, but that's a conversation for another day. But, when it comes to these people, all that's to say is there's the sort of, I guess, I don't know if this is probably a contradictory sounding phrase, but the liberal Zionists seem to express a bit of concern about the religious Zionists because they're scared of what they'll do to them if they get power. I guess, could you talk a little bit about that bizarre dynamic that you have this kind of far right and then centrist colonizer, and they have an internal tension going on?
Yeah, they do. I've said this for a long time. Israeli society is really just put together with Scotch tape. It's something that can disintegrate and is always just about to disintegrate. It really is. It's a bunch of groups of different people, of different groups, different societies that are really bunched together with very, very weak Scotch tape. And so people were very encouraged during the last couple of years when there were all these protests against Netanyahu and against his so-called judicial reform and so on. And they said, look, all Israelis are in the street. These Israelis want peace. I said, what the hell are you talking about? The only difference is that these people don't like those people because they just don't like how they talk, and they don't like to see themselves in the mirror because these West Bank settlers, these Ben Gvirs and Smotrich types, are a mirror image of the rest of Israel, and they hate it. So people like Ehud Olmert and all these other kind of Tel Aviv types of Zionists, it's the kind of Zionist, liberal Zionists that when they speak to me, they say, why do you have to be so extreme? We agree with you 95%, but why do you have to be so extreme? Why do you have to be so radical? Why do you cross the line? It's really the height of hypocrisy. And a good example for that is during the protests against Netanyahu, there were Israeli Air Force pilots who did not show up for duty. Now they have to show up every week for practice, for flight hours and that sort of thing, reservists. And they said, no, the fight for democracy is more important. We will not show up for duty. We will be protesting. But when they're called to bomb Gaza, they run. They can't go fast enough. So they don't protest when they have to bomb civilians in Gaza.
Yeah.
They protest because they don't like Netanyahu. This is a completely different. This is an internal nonsense. This is just a gossip column of internal Zionist Israeli nonsense. It has nothing to do with the bigger picture. These people, as soon as October 7th happened, they couldn't wait to get on a plane and start bombing civilians. And look, of course, we know what they've done. And it's not the beginning. I mean, they've been doing this for a very long time. And again, I always go back, and I like to remind people this has been going on for a long time. I mean, the idea of starving people, denying an entire population. What happened in after the invasion of Lebanon in 82 and the siege on Beirut? Whose idea was that? It was Rabin, who was defense minister, and there was this brutal siege on Beirut and the bombing of Beirut, the bombing of a capital city and the people who live in there, and again denying them water and food and so on. So I mean, there's nothing new about this except perhaps the way they express it and the fact that, like you said, now it's very easy to see it all and to everybody's got a camera and everybody's showing it, so people are exposed to it. But it's this whole idea that somehow there's a better Israeli society, a more liberal. It's internal gossip. And I'll give you one more example, if I may. My entire career, doing this work for more than 2 decades now, I've never compared and I've never brought up the Nazis. Now it's appropriate. And there were Germans who stood up to the Nazis and paid heavily. There were groups within German society, doctors, communists, others, who stood up and were sent to concentration camps and were executed. There were white South Africans, many of them, were Jewish, Joe Slovo and Ruth First and others, who were aiding Nelson Mandela in the military operations of the ANC. White people who stood up and paid heavily. Many were killed, bombed, exiled. Where's the Israeli opposition to Zionism? Where are the thousands, the hundreds, anything? If 100,000 Israelis went to the streets right now and demanded an end to the slaughter in Gaza, nobody would get killed. Maybe a few people will be arrested, but it's not going to be. Nobody's going to get shot. It's not going to be like that. It's not like what the Nazis did to the dissenters. It's not like what the South African apartheid regime did to dissenters. And where are they? So where is this liberal society? Where are these people? They're very comfortable being where they are, but they always fall. And they like being called peace, like a peace movement or liberal Zionists. But when push comes to shove, they always line up and they toe the line with Zionism and they toe the line with a genocidal apartheid state.
So then that makes me wonder your personal evolution, because you come from this society. Your family was deeply involved in the founding of it, as you've written about. And I imagine that there's a reason, right, why there's not an Israeli anti-Zionist left. Maybe there's a few people here and there, but there's not like any sort of group that we can point to, right? And I think there's a reason for that. There's a lot of ideological coherence around Zionism, a lot of indoctrination. Also, the level of impunity handed to Israel. There's no consequences for Zionism. So in that atmosphere, in that environment, in that culture, how do you come out of that? How does someone like you come out of that, having the views that you have? Like, what's different about you than everybody else in Israel?
I wish I could answer that. I have no idea.
You've never thought about this?
I mean, people ask me this question. I think about it. I've written about it. I really don't know. I mean, if you ask me, I don't know how you can drop a bomb knowing that you're going to kill children. I really don't know. I don't know how you can arrest children, detain them, shackle them, blindfold them. I don't know how you do that. I really don't. What is it that's missing? What is it that's been, nobody's born like that. Nobody's born like that, but there's a very intense education system that makes sure that by the time somebody is 15, 16, they're already done. They're totally indoctrinated. But at the end of the day, we're talking about people who live very close to each other. In other words, Israeli soldiers don't have to go overseas to kill people that they've never seen before. They just have to drive a few kilometers and they're right there. And they see that these are children and they see that these are civilians. And they don't care. And I don't understand. I can't understand I don't understand it. To be honest, I don't think a healthy mind is capable of understanding that level of racism, because I think it's a disease. It's a mental disease. It's something that's so deep. That's why I don't think you can cure it. You have to treat it, but you can't cure it. You know, South Africans didn't suddenly, white South Africans, stop being racist, but they were brought to their knees and they were faced with a new reality, and that was it. And they had no choice. And then, a generation later, another generation later, people are like, oh, well, you know what? The sky hasn't fallen. Nelson Mandela wasn't that bad after all. You know, I think that's what happened. Same thing, with other societies that had these, racist and fascist regimes and dictatorial regimes. And societies were torn apart. I mean, South African society was torn apart. In Latin America, when dictatorships fell, dictatorships that were propped by the CIA in the United States, when they collapsed, countries were torn apart. Spain had a civil war. Spain had a fascist regime in my lifetime, and Portugal, and Greece had a military dictatorship in my lifetime. And they all collapsed and they all fell originally, and the societies had to get up in the morning and deal with the new reality. And so I don't have an explanation, but I do know that the education system is intense. I hear what people, young people in my family are posting, and it's horrifying, what they're saying, and it's horrifying. And of course, I'm considered the evil one, so I'm the one that's kind of been shunned. But this is an insane society, and insane societies have to be brought down to their knees, faced with a new reality. And until, like you said, until there are consequences, severe consequences, they're not going to stop, which brings me back again to this ridiculous conversation about a ceasefire. First of all, why would they agree? Number one. And number two, can you imagine negotiating a ceasefire with Hitler?
No.
I mean, is anybody, and that's the appropriate comparison right now. That's the appropriate comparison. I mean, it's been a genocide for 8 decades, but this is certainly a heightened chapter within that genocide. And they get to agree to terms of a ceasefire. They need to be stopped immediately. There has to be an arms embargo. There had to have been an arms embargo a long time ago. Severe sanction. The Sixth Fleet. People always talk about our tax dollars going to support this. American tax dollars. American tax dollars pay for the Sixth Fleet. The Sixth Fleet is in the Mediterranean. They can stop it tomorrow. They can impose a no-fly zone over Gaza right away and start giving humanitarian aid. And then dismantle the Gaza prison. The Gaza Strip, people talk about it like it's a country. It's a prison. Israel invented it. There should be no Gaza Strip. It should be torn down, and people should be allowed to travel and go back to their homes and get the water they need and the medicine they need and so on. But the entire conversation on Palestine is so insane, and it's driven by the insanity of Israeli society, by the insanity of Zionism.
Yeah, I think that it's... I didn't used to make that comparison either. You mentioned not having made the Nazi comparison ever until now. Same here. I never felt comfortable saying that, but now I have no hesitation whatsoever, because I don't know how else you can look at Gaza except for a Holocaust. It's a death camp. I mean, the people who are killing people in Gaza are saying they want to kill everyone in Gaza. Yeah. They're celebrating the killings in TikTok videos. Yeah. Both like the low-level soldiers up to the very top. Yeah. I don't know how else you're supposed to look at that. And I think it's quite unprecedented in the sense that it's just so technologically advanced. We've never had like this level of slaughter with such high-tech weaponry before. I guess it's like, okay, yeah, it's not gas chambers, but it's like 2,000-pound bombs on like every single square kilometer of Gaza. Like, I don't know. Is there one way that's preferable to the other? They're just like mass killing people constantly. And just these images that are coming out. And, some of the rhetoric around it is so juvenile, because you talk about Israel needs to be brought to its knees and there needs to be consequences. And I often make that, not just the Nazi comparison. I think now we can kind of understand in like a weird academic sense, how, Jim Crow South existed, how, chattel slavery, how people were able to justify that. Like you can see in real time, the way a society can be essentially brainwashed and manipulated into supporting atrocious acts on a collective scale. And then you have people like, I don't want to give him too much attention, but people like Piers Morgan, for example, or others who will demand all the condemnation of those fighting for their survival. And that's where it's interesting to me. It's like, I don't understand what people expect at this point. Like, there's nobody stopping Israel. So why are we supposed to accept people across the region to not try to stop Israel for themselves? Like if no one else is going to protect them, they have to try to protect themselves. And I don't understand why that's so difficult to understand when it comes to the idea of like what the Yemenis are doing, for example, or just Palestinians, like Palestinians shooting back. I mean, is that a shocker to anybody? Or in Lebanon, what Hezbollah is doing, is that a surprise to anyone? Or the fact that Iran hasn't even responded for what just took place with the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. But already the US, Germany, Italy, France, the UK have put out statements condemning any retaliation from Iran as an act of aggression. Anyways, I just said a bunch of things. I'm just curious, your thoughts on the idea that, Israel's violence is not only like legitimate, but at the very least, let's go for a ceasefire. Whereas none of Israel's victims are ever allowed to fight back.
I remember like growing up hearing about, the partisans who fought the Nazi or the fascism and, throughout Europe and so on. The ANC in South Africa and, again, like I said, people like Joe Slovo and Ruth First and Albie Sachs and all these people who paid a heavy price for their participating in the armed resistance and many, many others, of course. These happen to be just the, the white Jews that were part of it. But of course, I never remember having to condemn them. People who fought for democracy, in Latin America, all these other places, in Spain and so on. I never ever heard that you have to condemn them. The condemnation is reserved only for Palestinians who dare to fight back. When Palestinians resist, when Palestinians fight for freedom, you're not allowed to call them freedom fighters. You have to condemn them for what they do. And people just kind of nod and accept this, and you mentioned Piers Morgan and Yemen. The first time he interviewed me was about Yemen for some reason. And, they brought in a van with all the equipment. It was this big production. And he mentioned something about Yemen. I said, well, the only responsible party so far dealing and responding to the genocide are the Yemeni forces. He stopped the interview. It was like a 5-minute interview. He cut it. And that was the end of it. And I'm sitting there. He said, what is this it? I mean, how dare you say that this is, how can you call them responsible? What do you mean, how do you call it responsible? This is a responsible reaction when there's a genocide going on. They blocked the Bab el-Mandeb. Israel is paying a heavy economic price as a result of this. The port of Eilat is going bankrupt. Not a single car, not a single, nothing is being, imported. I think the port of Eilat normally brings in something like 150,000 cars a year. Not one car has gone through the port of Eilat. So, I mean, for some reason, we're expected to condemn Palestinians for anything they do, but not, it's a whole different standard. I reject that completely. I completely reject that. I think the Palestinians stood up. I think the Palestinians, they did on October 7th is exactly what we chant for at every protest. If we don't get it, shut it down. They shut it down. They shut the apartheid state down for months, and it hasn't recovered yet. The apartheid state has not recovered yet from the Palestinian actions of October 7th, and that's what you're supposed to do when you have an apartheid state, shut it down. And who did it? Who did it? Fighters that came from one of the poorest, most oppressed areas in the world, where a glass of water is a luxury. Mm-hmm. Those guys managed to come out, prove the entire Israeli military apparatus as completely incompetent. And there's all these theories. Yes, the Israelis knew everything in advance. They let it happen. You out of your minds, they're incompetent. They are incompetent. This happened exactly 50 years and 1 day after the surprise attack of October 1973, where once again, the Israeli army was caught off guard and incompetent. Of course, Palestinians were able to accomplish much more with far less resources than the Egyptian and the Syrian armies. And look what they've done. Exactly what is supposed to be done. Shut it down.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news.